Good afternoon, my name is Karan Rai, and today I'll be presenting to you my interpretation of World War I through a photogenic timeline, in which the photos I choose are placed in a chronological order from around early 1912 to the end of 1917. So for my first photo that I chose, I decided to choose just a simple snapshot of what would be a common shopping center district for the people of France, or more specifically in this place, Albert Salms, within France, in which this shopping center was known as the Arms Place, in which people would go in and dine, they would shop, they would gamble, drink, and enjoy themselves during a time in which they deduced to be relative peace, as there were no major conflicts going on between countries. However, to most historians, including us students today, we all know that during this time, it was far than peace. It was far than peaceful between countries, as countries by that time, different European countries had both different militaristic, imperialistic, social, and nationalistic ideologies, which all created rifts and tension between them that only grew as time went on. And not to mention that another important factor which boosted this tension in between countries was also the alliance system, in which alliances were created so that no one country could have all the power in order to create an international dominating force. However, one can argue that the ideology behind alliances created both long term and short term causes to the war, since you had long term causes like the Three Emperors League, which created the alliance between Russia, Austria, and Germany, creating the basics of the relationship that would ultimately take form and make the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. While at the start of the war in 1914, it was also the cause of alliances themselves that brought more and more people, combatants, into the war, making the war more than just simple two countries into the entire continental of Europe, and thus into the entirety of the world itself. So following soon after the start of the war in 1914, we had one of these countries taking initiative action in order to take out its nearest competitor, Germany, in its Schieffelin Plan, early August 1914, in which the main idea was to go across Belgium and into France, taking over France so that they can then have a better chance of defending against their eastern oppressors, Russians, which were already quite, excuse my language, pissed at them since they already declared hostility towards Serbia. However, though this plan ultimately did fail in terms of getting into the heart of France itself, the Germans did make sure to cause multiple casualties, both soldiers and civilians alike, while they trotted along their way through Belgium, which, again, from the alliance system, brought England into the war, as England was an ally of Belgium. But while this was happening on the Western Front, the Eastern Front had no time to wait and let the Germans become stronger by taking France, which is why we move forward to the Battle of Tannenberg by the end of August, or more specifically August 26, 1914, in which the Russian forces engaged German forces were at, you guessed it, Tannenberg, and caused one of the more greater casualties to soldiers during the beginning periods of the war. But again, while that was happening at Tannenberg, the British and French soon had a quick response to the failed Schieffelin Plan through the Battle of the Marne, conducted from September 6th to 12th, and could be easily classified as a good case to show brutalization and shock of how many people just were killed during that 1 week between September 6th and September 12th. And this could also be seen as one of the more earlier times during the war in which advanced technology was used to cause multiple casualties in terms of semi-automatic bombings and artillery, and would form the basics of what would be known for the majority of the war to be the Western Front, a land ruled by trench warfare and nobody gaining any more ground on either side. But while this Western Front, this Western event, was continuing on for essentially another year or so, we had another major factor come into play while all this was happening, and it all started with the sinking of a ship, or more specifically, the sinking of the Lusitania, carrying U.S. passengers and apparently non-friendly cargo. However, the U.S. disguised this non-friendly cargo as just simply being for its own allied team, the British as well as the French. What's significant about this event that I chose to especially highlight is that it then caused a further political consequence further into U.S. history and caused its own, many would discuss, to be a whole entire battle fought on their home front, in which, while the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram were justifiable for the U.S. government to go to war against Germany, many people thought that it was unjust and it was unfair and it gained no popular vote, which prompted for the use of the aforementioned political consequence, the Espionage Act, which was declared by the end of 1916 at the near beginning of 1917, while the Lusitania sinking was conducted in 1915. However, even though the U.S. was about to enter the war itself, the war by this point seemed to be almost ending in such a way in which that the British and French finally made their final assault in this trench warfare-filled area on the Western Front through the Battle of the Somme in 1916, in which over 60,000 British soldiers were lost on the first day through the use of advanced military weaponry and technology, through artillery fire, machine guns, such and so forth. However, these losses were, some may say, justifiable, as in the end, the British and French soon pushed out the Germans and back into their own territory, or back into such a state in which Germany was weakened enough to not really continue with the war forward. And I don't think most people can attribute much of this to the Battle of Somme, while we can also attribute this win to the Battle of Verdun, which was conducted earlier in 1916 and was prominently known famously for the French soldiers' resistance towards ongoing German infantry constantly coming at them to pass into Verdun. But obviously the French did not let that happen. But in any case, the Battle of the Somme was a particularly eventful battle in which it sort of just decided the eventual outcome of World War I, as this was when the Allies were starting to get a greater push. And because of this, Russia was having its own battle on its own front, similar to that of the US, but it was taken to such a degree in which a revolution started, conducted by a Marxist communistic movement led by Vladimir Lenin, in which a 5-year conflict beginning late 19th century ended on the October Revolution 1917, in which it consisted of a plain but effective coup d'etat on the Winter Palace, in which little to no lives were taken, although some were injured, and it was soldiers. And so because of this new formed government, Lenin decided to actually listen to what the people wanted and finally got Russia out of the war entirely, which was when the war was starting to come to an end and Germany soon lost its balance towards the ending of 1917. But however, this act of causality needed to be addressed amongst the winning side, the Triple Entente, and so the international event known as the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was formed as a way for essentially the Allied sides to figure out what to do next. And although this event was supposedly to become a step towards a greater and better and more peaceful time, some countries, one can argue, better were off than others. And this can be seen as the harsh treatment dealt to Germany is a prime example, in which Germany, by the end of it, was blamed with the majority of the war crimes as well as the actual cause of starting the war to begin with. And with that came consequences both in the form of territorial, in which several allied nations as well as smaller nations took chunk by chunk of Germany's land and drastically reduced it, and this can also be said towards its military, its navy, as well as its air force. But besides territorial, Germany, as well as other countries, experienced economic consequences as well, in which huge war reparations needed to be dealt with in order to effectively pay off for the amount of damage that had been done towards people's homes, livelihood, soldiers' livelihood, places, and such and so forth, which, although did end the war and brings us back to the beginning of this presentation, created a time where no conflict was really dealt in. This time was sure enough far from a peaceful solution and sooner paved the way towards a more deadlier war, which would take place almost 20 to 30 years later, World War II. But for the people right now, as said before, this was simply just a time to rebuild and just a time to live life where they haven't had before. But for the common man, this wasn't the case, as World War I was bigger than anticipated and ultimately affected everybody and everything that they know, including the arms placed in Albert Salms. Thank you for listening.